YehTehwagi matangachu Tenkirka inyaga Mulumuluga Enanistena
Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Rebuilding education from an African place of being. Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Rebuilding education from an African place of being. Build deep and complete.
Do you know of the water of life?
What's the big idea? What's the big idea? Original again, start from the heart. Not up, too deep. I see, I freeze. Mathematics, matrix, institutes, patterns. 1, 2, 3, you learn how to read. Classic.
Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Rebuilding education from an African place of being. Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Building education from an African place of being.
Dip down, dip and down, dip and down. We're in there. Dip down, dip and down, dip and down. We're in there. Inside of who you are. Inside of who you are. behavior is the savior. It seems to be inside of who you are. The sky is like a storybook with sand in your eyes. See the light, come see sunrise inside of who you are.
Hashima family, greetings, welcome to the Black Open University show. This is Ayas Damari Bartekun from the Black Open University. Welcome. Let me greet you with our salute. YehTehwagi Sehlamta, Exir Yimasagan Hashima Tehwagi Asab. Create to be praised, respect the warrior idea. We have a very, very special show today. But before we get into the show, obviously we must give our thanks to all those that have come before. A special thanks to the one beloved Omowale, who has given, as always, a fantastic show. This is really a very powerful lecture series that I is bringing for the item. So I trust that ones are, downloading the podcast, rewinding the YouTube, and listening carefully to these very, very special words that our beloved scholar is sharing with us. But of course, we must give thanks to all the presenters on the station. Too many to list, but I will name a few: Brother Dougie, the one, the beautiful Lady Leo, and the one Supreme, and the many others. You know who you are. Big up to the management and big up to the studio engineers. And yes. We have a very, very special show today, and in this show we're giving a tribute. It's a tribute show. Do you know who the tribute's for? I wonder if you could guess who the tribute is for. We've had a passing family, a legendary mathematician in our community, a groundbreaking computer. I know she wouldn't mind me calling her a computer, because the era that the one is from is a time when the computer was the person. The person was the computer doing the computing. Yes. So I would imagine that you have all heard that the one Katherine Johnson has passed today, and with that transition, it's for us at the Black Open University. It marks a special point to celebrate this one's fantastic developments and our great potentials, the great potentials that existed in her, that exist in all ones, and with the right cultivation. She will cite her story. You're going to hear about her story later in this show in several ways, but you will hear that family is important, a value for education is important, and a value for culture. So we're going to come to that. There's 3 parts, 3 tribute episodes, sound bites, clips, audio excerpts that I want to share with you to bring us somewhere towards the beautiful mind of the one. Before we do, the show has a format, and so we should work through the format. The first part of the show is the Gazette show, the Gazette part of the show. Gazette means province. We've been generally, we always speak about the phase of the moon. Where is the moon? And some of you have been asking, well, why do we do that? It's very important. It's important for many reasons, but even today's show, when we feature this fantastic mind who assisted nations with their development of mathematics and science and advancement, it's important to note that she spent much of her time observing the moon and its position, how to get to the moon. And imagine that. In this point here, I'm simply pointing out the phases, just so we have more observation that there is a significant body outside of the Earth in a special dance with the Earth, and we should look up and note it. So we have just passed the new moon, the point called the new moon. The new moon is basically the point where the moon is in between the Earth and the sun. The moon is making an orbital motion around the Earth. The two are in a very close dance, like a binary system. But basically, the moon is making a dance around the Earth. And so it goes in this way that generates what appears to be a phasing of the moon. So it appears to get lighter to full moon and then darker to new moon. And so we've just passed the new moon, which means we are looking at the shadow side of the moon, which means you can't see it because it's the shadow side and we're looking into space, so it's dark. Hence you don't see the moon around these times. But over the next few days you will gradually see a growing crescent. This is typically referred to the waxing crescent, the growing crescent. And so this is the simple observation for the show. We should observe these things. I'm inviting you to think about that, to observe it, trusting that the sky is clear and the positions are just right. To observe it, make an effort to do that. If you are not able to do that, to invest your consciousness into some technology to help you do it, like Stellarium. Stellarium is a planetary software, highly recommended, and this will let you see more than the moon's motions. You can see all sorts of things and check to see how it correlates to the actual physical reality that you can see. And if you have telescope, fantastic, you're going to see more. So, yep, this is the Gazette phase of the show, and simply we are highlighting this importance. In past shows I've gone a bit deeper into other objects. We will return to that, but this show is a special tribute, and so we are going to move on. The news, Zena Gize. Zena Gize, I'm keeping it concentrated because now we are rapidly approaching our festival. So the news is the festival. We have a festival. It's during Science Week, British Science Week. We have a festival of creative learning at the Chestnut Community Centre. All the information you need is on our websites, abundancecentre.org/festival, abundancecentre.org/festival, and you will see that we have a fantastic range of activities, workshops in the evening and some things in the day and some things in the early morning. And I've touched into these things on the show before. We're going to do some fantastic things. So I'm going to speak about those in detail a little bit later on after we've done our tribute. I want to get get involved in that and let that flow first and reason after. And I hope that you will work through the show. I think this show will help to see why we're a bit different from the rest of the show, them, not just on this station, on all stations. Black Open University isn't a communal station, a communal programming designed to work for a learner cooperative. So we are encouraging direct learnership of specific things related to STEM plus the arts. That's science, technology, engineering and math plus the arts. So we call it STEAM. That's steamed up. be getting steamed up in the studio. Steamed up. Science, technology, engineering, math, plus the arts. So this thing here now, this wonderful well, Kedma Ayatoch is a wonderful ancestor, and now I would dare to take the liberty that she would thoroughly endorse the way we wish to profile her great work. So there'll be 3 segments in this. One is an interview with her where she speaks to her story, and you can hear from her about her story. She's being interviewed. You'll hear this, and that's great. This, by the way, is the one in the film. You may have seen the film for this, but I'm not going to focus in on the film side of things. Maybe the film is the way you've come to know this lady, but we should just deal with the direct realities. And in doing that, I'm going to go a bit further. This is what I was saying about going a bit further than the average. After we've done the introduction with her, we're going to go into a feature on her specialism, her focus, one of the areas of mathematics that she was a groundbreaker for, analytic geometry. Yeah, that's right, analytic geometry on the Black Open University. Imagine that. For real, we're going to do it. I've selected some material for you to hear, and because I am talking to ones about these things, different ages, different ones, and I have a sense that many of us are a little disaffected with the whole math business. Some of us are not, but many are disaffected with it, and just the idea of listening to mathematical talking might be a bit hard to think, even to comprehend that you would do that. Now, I'm appealing to you. When you hear the sister speak, and you hear the great things that she did, surely you will know that she would be most honoured to know that you've pushed yourself beyond your comforts to absorb that which she focused on and ground broke. Yes, so I'm going to invite you to listen to that kind of conversation. Then we're going to return back to a narrative about her work, more documentary style. And as I said, Black Open University, it's learner cooperative and empowerment to the direct learning, more than the history of historical characters. It's important to get behind the character and try to follow the journey that they took to break the ground that they broke, to realize that which they realized. It's a useful thing to do, and it's the way. And the purpose for that is to open up the way for more movement, more inspiration. As she was inspired by her father and other ones, so too each one of you should be inspired. Each one of us should be inspired and go deeper, be encouraged to go deeper. I'm very pleased today because we had a class, and some of the cadets, they were doing some etymology. I spoke to ones about this last cycle. We were doing etymology. Etymology is about the roots and history of words, and we are drilling down into mathematical words and their etymology, which is different from the meaning. This is the thing. I think it's important. I'll re-emphasize this point. It's important for us to pay even more attention to the words that we're using in the math as it is right now, in terms of its origin, the origin of the words, which typically in this era and this space typically is Greek, Latin, rooted into these kind of culture and word. But in the rooting of the word, the origins of the word, that the characters around the origin of words is also a story, a history of how the word then evolves into current use. All of these things are very important, and they sit in a special place different from the meaning of the word. Obviously they're related, but they're not the same thing. And because we are coming from an African place of being, it's important to appreciate the cultural difference and to see correlation. When you check to root words, you can find appropriate correlations in your root languages, and that's important. It's important to bring the root ideas, if they are still correct, because sometimes some things have been named with erroneously wrong. They've been given the wrong name, and just because of the legacy of things, people don't like to change and don't like to say that they gave a thing the wrong name. Things just stay, and so generations end up saying some stuff, naming things, calling the name of a thing, and that word sound is not a correct meaning in any way to the thing they're talking about. So inside of that, there's a lot of space for reform, and to do reform, you should have to know the word that you're working with, whether it needs reforming. What was the idea? How did the one who selected that word come to that point? Is it still useful for our needs? It's important. Black Open University. So yeah, today I enjoyed some of the cadets doing their work with their etymologies, and we were exploring some words, and some of these things came up. We found words and characters that feature in the story of the beloved Katherine Johnson. And yeah, historical characters like Euler, the Euler method, a mathematical method that she broke ground with in NASA to develop ways to work out how to meet a certain point in space at a certain time, how to get something to a certain place in space at a certain point, a certain time. It requires a huge amount of calculation. And before the computer, the machine, humans were doing that. And those humans, in this situation for NASA, the best they had was this lady, who you're going to hear about. So it's amazing. It's amazing. So we should listen carefully to her story. And those in the class who are coming across some characters, I would say a couple of things about the historic characters. It's important to respect historical characters and their good works, and to study carefully their stories of how they came about doing their thing that they did. The slippery part of this thing, though, is that the way history is told is often bias. Yeah, it's often biased. So things get left out, historical context gets left out, and so things that are going on at the time of certain discoveries and innovations, other things happening in the world are not covered, that have a bearing on the flow of resource and the flow of desire for tech or innovation or domination or other things like this. And it's important to take the full context to try and source global history around each historical character and their historical innovations. So yeah, that's our approach at the Black Open University when studying key innovators. And it was touching to see how they portrayed this in the film Hidden Colors. Very, very, very touching to see how that was done. Anyway, we're going to move, we're going to flow. We're going to move, we're going to flow. And this thing is quite a feature. So without too much further ado, I'm going to get to it. It's a lengthy one. Like I said, there's 3 parts to this. Normally, as I said, I normally touch into what we call, well, it's the weekly features. This is the weekly feature, but also the core of our learning programs. I normally touch into that now, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way for this show. I would like to bring these things into the end of this, after we've heard these clips, to touch through how these things relate into the level being 9 class, how they relate into the Educating with Unified Knowledge class, pedagogy. The level being 9 is a GCSE math program, which is a STEM program, science, technology, engineering, math, developed around creative projects for young children to teenagers, and just a way to do advanced things in a shorter time, in a deeper way, at a younger age. So level being 9 is that. The pedagogy class, Educating with Unified Knowledge Foundation Course 1, is an introduction for parents and teachers about the method of teaching that we call unified knowledge, YehTehwagi. And this that I'm speaking about is coming from that place. This is the basis of the Black Open University. We have the hair structure science course. I'm not going to speak too much about that today, but this is an example of one of our programs. And also the YehTehwagi class, African warrior dance. The African warrior dance is something I highly recommend to all ones. Every Friday at the Chestnut Community Centre, but you do need to book your place. You need to enroll. It's not a turn up on the day and have a go thing. It's a deep kind of program of cultural arts, using cultural arts to advance math and science ideas, but those cultural arts at the same time are African martial arts. It's involving dance, it's involving martial arts, drama, it's involving a whole different way of developing freedom of expression. Yes, that is what the YehTehwagi is about, warrior dance. So there's a lot in it. It doesn't fit into any one definition. So those who would want one thing, probably you will see that it's not that one thing. It's several things. And this is a way of culture. You might not realize, or you may know, that many of these cultural arts that people do, in its roots, these things have always come together as a holistic form, but they've been split up over time to make them more commercially viable for consumers, to make it more consumable. But in the process of doing it, some essence is taken out. So that essence being that which happens when several things overlap, several circles of learning overlap, and there's some space where something is happening with all of them in a special synergy. If you take these things out, you can't get the synergy. YehTehwagi has nothing taken out. So language is fundamental. Unified knowledge language is inside of the class. Movement is in the class. Breathing is in the class. Martial arts is in the class. Dance is in the class. Drama is in the class. Okay, enough of that. So, Katherine Johnson, I should hail her. Ras Astamari, Katherine Johnson. Ras's head teacher. Ras Astamari, Katherine Johnson. Ras's head. And she's done a lot of work. She's a head teacher. She's inspired many. She's nurtured just a huge inflow of minds into higher learning. This is a guide. She's an educative guide. She's transcended today. She's made her transition. and we have to hail her up every time, especially because she's a leader for this thing called mathematics, and as an African, she was able to enter into that space that at the time was guarded. It's still guarded. Many of you don't seem to know. Let me just tell you something before we play this thing. The mathematics domain is still guarded. It's still a guarded space. There's still societies around it that don't want to see certain people in there. That don't want to see certain variation of how to approach a thing. So, yeah, she got in. And when she got in, she just did her stuff and shone. Let the light shine. Fantastic. Now, for me, we shouldn't have to break into anything. We shouldn't have to break through doors to be. This is why we need to come from an African place of being, set up institutions and structures where there is no breaking through something to get to quality, or to get, I say equality, but to get to quality, to a quality space. The lady had to steal books to learn coding for the computers because the racists wouldn't give her the books. Imagine that. But we're not so far away from that, unfortunately. It seems like we are, but I know the educational statistics. I know the performance, progress 8, attainment 8. We've spoken about it before, and we're not so far away from it. Different technique for separation of talent, for the dumbing down of one's different technique, but still, yeah, forward.
Build deep and complete.
Do you know of the water of life?
What's the big idea? What's the big idea? Original again, start from the heart. Not art, too deep. I see, I freeze. Mathematics, matrix, institutes, patterns. 1, 2, 3, you learn naturally. Classic.
Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Rebuilding education from an African place of being. Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Building education from an African place of being. Radio.
You learn naturally radio.
You learn naturally radio.
Yes.
Radio.
Good evening, I'm Kathy Lewis. A special treat for you tonight, a conversation with a pioneer at NASA Langley, an extraordinary woman whose math skills were so sharp, she was known as a human computer. 30 minutes probably will be just enough to whet your appetite to learn more about Katherine Johnson. She worked at NASA Langley during the 50s, a woman and an African American busting through barriers and making history along the way. Here's a look at some of the highlights of her career.
Before there was electronic computers to do all the calculations, the NACA used to hire women who had degrees in mathematics. And it was thought that women would do it more accurately and pay more attention to the fine detail, and men wouldn't have the patience to do that. Katherine Johnson worked with the Space Orbital Mechanics branch, and they asked her to calculate, certain times when the rocket would have to fire and when they would launch the spacecraft away from the rocket and where she thought the spacecraft would actually land so they'd be able to recover it.
She always told us that my grandfather, who only went to the 6th grade, was the smartest man she ever saw. And he could do numbers faster than you could bat your eye. So she started out, she said she used to count the plates and the silverware, and so she always loved numbers. And when she went to college, the professor had her, and everything he taught her, she was just maxing. And he said, I think you'd make a good math researcher. And she said, well, what's that? He said, well, that's for you to find out. And so that was her dream from the beginning. She said, I want to be a research mathematician. We knew that she worked at Langley. It wasn't a discussion of what she did, we just knew it was math. And we all did well in math. She would never brag on herself. And most of our knowledge came from us seeing something and then coming home and saying, Mom, this book says you did A, B, and C. And that's basically how we started getting our own history of our mom and what she did.
When they first switched over to electronic computers, a lot of people, because they were so new, didn't trust the calculations that they produced. They would want a mathematician to check behind the computer until they gained some sort of credence here at the center.
Presented to Katherine G. Johnson, this flag was carried aboard the 4th flight of Columbia in recognition of your personal contribution toward making space available. The awards that she has received have been many, but some of the most meaningful ones for her were the letters she would get from young school children. And one little girl called her long distance, and after talking to her and all, she said, "Are you still alive?" Because, you know, when you talk about people that you want to read about or do a project on, they're usually deceased. But she's 92 and still moving. And she said she never considered herself working. She loved what she did. She said it wasn't work. And she has enjoyed her life, truly.
And very much alive, Katherine Johnson is with us tonight in the studio. Nice to see you again, Ms. Johnson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It is such a pleasure to talk with you, and there's so much ground we can cover in the course of the conversation. I think one of the most interesting things to note is this use of this word computer, because I think we think of it as an electronic device, and yet before electronics there were people like you who were people who compute, or computers.
With a data sheet that wide.
And you would just have to figure out all the calculations across there.
That's right.
So I want to go back to your childhood, because it seems like to me that's where a lot of this was, it became so ingrained and instilled in you. You said that your father was the smartest man you ever knew.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Tell me about him.
I thought he was the tallest, the handsomest, the straightest, but he was just my father. And we had a hard textbook, and they had very difficult word problems this long in there, and you just read it to him and he could tell you the answer.
So he obviously had a gift for mathematics.
Evidently.
Yeah. And so he, what did he do for a living?
He farmed, he logged. Then he eventually left and went to work at the hotels so we could go to school. He could look at a tree and tell you the number of board feet he could get out of it.
Wow.
And he was just a smart man.
So when you say he eventually went to the hotels so that you could go to school, what do you mean by that?
Well, when we were born in the country, and when we got school age, we moved to town. And he always said, "You will go to college." I didn't know what a college was.
And he had only gone to 6th grade, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So when my sister spent 1 year on campus, her first year in high school, he said, "Well, I can't do this 8 times." So he went down to the college and found a house and rented it. And we moved there every September and back home in June for 8 years.
Wow, so all the children could go to school.
So everybody could go to high school and college.
That's amazing.
And he put all 4 of us through college.
And that's you stop and think about that for a moment. That's really an astounding thing.
That was on his salary, which his basic salary was $100 a month.
Oh my gosh!
But he worked extra here and there.
Yeah. And your mother worked as well?
No.
She did not. She stayed home.
She stayed at home.
So as you think about that, I mean, the thing that occurs to me about that story is, here's somebody who decided that education was important, in fact, so important, that he was going to orient your whole family life and his whole work life.
That's right.
To achieve that.
Right.
That's an amazing thing. So when you went to college, did you go to school with your siblings then? Were you
all of us went out. My sister, my brother, then I was next to my brother, was a grade below me, because I skipped a couple of grades, and as a result, I was ahead of the boys.
So you actually graduated. How old were you when you graduated from college?
18.
18. So everybody knew you had a big old brain on you by that time, right? They knew it.
But I didn't know it.
But you didn't know it. Yeah. And so I wonder if you'd talk about where you discovered this love for math. I mean, clearly your father probably inspired some of that. But
sure.
Did college give you some of that as well?
It wasn't always my favorite subject, because you see, I majored in French, but I could easily have majored in English and math. And when I went to college, you didn't have to choose your major at your first semester. I was walking across the campus and I met a math teacher who said, "I'm coming back to teach math this year, and if you are not in my class, I will come and find you."
Wow.
So I didn't start majoring in math till the second semester of my sophomore year.
And so you graduate from high school at 18. How is it then that you got to NASA? Because you had this professor who said, "I think you're going to make a great research mathematician."
Right.
So you don't even know what that meant.
He taught me every course that the college offered and a couple extra. In one of those, I was the only student. He was so great. He would walk into the classroom, reach in his pocket, take out a piece of chalk, and go immediately to the blackboard. He knew exactly where you were and what was next. He only referred to the textbook to give an assignment. He was great. Dr. W.W. Sheffield Clayton.
So you graduated from high school at 14, college at 18. You have this marvelous professor who says you will make a great research mathematician. What's the path after that gets you to NASA?
Well, I taught in Marion, Virginia, and then I taught in Morgantown, West Virginia. In the meantime, I had gotten married, so I stopped teaching and raised a family. And it wasn't until the 1940s that I went back to teaching, because my husband became ill. I completed that year for him, and then we moved to another school in Bluefield, Virginia, and we both taught there until 1952, when I came to Newport News, Virginia. That was an accident too. Margaret said, "What you going to do when you go home?" I said, "Nothing special." She said, "Come go home with us. My husband will get you a job." And he got 2 jobs. So I applied for Langley, but they had done their hiring for the year. So I had to wait for a whole year to go to Langley. So I went to Langley in June of 1953. In the meantime, I substituted at Huntington High School, and I worked with the USO, and I guess maybe that's all I did until...
That's enough. That's enough. So if we think about what the world was like in 1953, of course it was still very segregated at that point.
Yes. I didn't feel the segregation at NASA, because everybody there was doing research. You had a mission and you worked on it, and it was important to you to do your job and play bridge at lunch. And I didn't feel any segregation. I didn't feel the segregation. I knew it was there, but I didn't feel it. It did not affect me.
See, I wonder about that. And maybe this is a factor of having lived in a world that was a certain way, and that's just the way it was.
Yeah.
But I think it's really hard for people who didn't come up in that era, who weren't consciously aware in that era, to understand what that was like.
Well, as you say, you were brought up in it. That's the way it was conducted, and you lived with it.
So you started work at NASA Langley, and you're doing these just astounding calculations for incredibly important missions that NASA was working on at the time.
I started out working on airplanes, because when I went there, that's what it was, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. When the space program came along, I just happened to be working with guys, and when they had briefings on it, I asked permission to go. And they said, well, the girls don't usually go. And I said, well, is there a law? They said, no. I said, well, so then my boss said, let her go. And I began attending the briefings. You were already doing the work, but you didn't know exactly what it was. And gradually I did more. And they'd do something that I knew more about the geometry of the program, all about the mapping to the here and there, and so it was a very easy transition.
And you really were very familiar, knew very well many of these incredibly well-known people connected to NASA, many people whose names we would know. I'm thinking about John Glenn in particular, because it's just,
well, we did get to meet the astronauts, and they were as excited as we were, and we just looked at them and all.
But you know, it's so interesting because we talk about electronic computers, and I think in this generation we think of computers as being electronic devices. But back then, and now we talk about human error, we tend more to trust the electronic answer than we do the human answer. But back then, it sounds like they really trusted the human answer more. They were more suspicious of the electronic answer.
Yes, in particular, when John Glenn was to be the first astronaut to go up into the atmosphere and come back, and they wanted him to come back in a special place, and that was what I did. I computed his trajectory. And from then on, anytime they were going to compute trajectories, they were given mostly, all of them to my branch. And I did most of the work on those by hand. But when he got ready to go up, he said, call her. And if she says the computer's right, I'll take it.
That's amazing.
That was amazing that he did call and say that the very first time he made a trip into the atmosphere, and he wanted to arrive at a given place, he wanted me to check it out to be sure that the computer was right.
Did you ever have a moment where the enormity of that hits you? I mean, here you are making calculations. When you said he wants to arrive at a certain place, I thought, yeah, he'd probably just like to arrive anywhere, right? I mean, that's a piece of it, too. The enormity of that must have been quite something.
It was an assignment, and it was simple. You had to consider the rotation of the Earth, and equally important, when we were going to the moon, you had to know the location of the moon and where it was when you took off, and where it was when you got there. See, the moon is going that way, and you were going this way because you want to intersect the moon in a certain place. It was intricate, but it was possible.
And so then at night, you're doing this amazing work by day, and then at night you're coming home and your mom and grandma and all the rest of it. I mean, that must have been, must have been amazing.
And my husband became ill during that period, too.
So you had to deal with that as well?
With that as well.
Sure. You know, I wonder, you said, I know that your children, in the video piece that we saw, which Lisa Godley did a great job of producing, you know, your I think it was your daughter who said they were all good at math too.
Yes.
Do you think this is, I mean, your father was good at math, you're a genius at math, your children, is this a genetic thing?
Could have been. My mother had been a teacher until she married and moved into the country. I was always around people who were learning something. I liked to learn. I think very often that's missing with kids today. They don't want to learn.
So what do you think is the reason for that? What do we do about that?
I don't know, other than constantly say to them, you need to learn how to learn. And then you want to know. So I say that to students everywhere.
Yeah.
You learn if you want to. So you've got to want to learn.
You know, they're doing all this research now on the differences between boys' brains and girls' brains, and they say that girls and boys can do the same kinds of math. It's just that sometimes girls' brain development lags a little bit in middle school. They wind up catching up. And as a consequence, they don't necessarily take the classes because they're not as confident that boys take at that time. I wonder what you think about that kind of research and whether there are gender differences in how we deal with math.
I think the difference is in the desire to learn. Girls, I found myself very inquisitive. I wanted to know what was going on and why, about whatever was the subject at the time. It was important to me to learn why. Girls, some of them are reluctant to ask questions. They feel that they're just being curious, but if you want to know, you ask a question. There's no such thing as a dumb question. It's dumb if you don't ask it. But girls are capable of doing everything men are capable of doing. Sometimes they have more imagination than men.
I thought that was interesting too, that the historian at NASA said the feeling at the time was that women would be more accurate than men. I thought that was interesting. I mean,
well, men don't pay attention to small things. They're not interested in the fact, in the how you do it. Just give me the answer. I find that true about some teachers who teach answers. I never have taught answers. I teach you what the problem is, how to attack it. If you attack it properly, you'll get the answer.
Which is, in some respects, you know, we've had this conversation about standards of learning tests and the sort of the teaching to the test and the big concerns that teachers have about this.
Well, the attitude of my daughter, who was one of them who was teaching last, said that they taught only to the test. She said, so there's a lot of material out there that's not being taught because it's not on the test. Well, that's unfair to the student. It's unfair to the teacher that they are being taught that way. So I think it's important that you learn the background of what you're working on and how to do it. And you get the right answer. If you don't get it the first time, you'll get it the second time. But you don't arrive at it by teaching answers.
So I know you still go into schools and talk to young people from time to time. And you said, one little girl you said was surprised you were still alive.
Yeah, and the pictures in the textbook, you're supposed to be dead.
That's so funny. So do you still watch the development of the space program, and what do you think about where we are right now with that?
Oh, I don't watch it as much as I have done in the past. I'm very proud of what they're doing and how they're doing it and why. You see, if you lose your curiosity, then you stop learning. You must. And the scientists, they say, well, what good does it do us to go to space? Well, what good does it do you to stay home?
It's a great question.
So the important thing is that it's out there. We want to know all about it. We can
It's a great point. Katherine Johnson, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. I always enjoy talking with you. I wish we had another hour. Every time I talk with you, I learn a little bit more. I like that about you.
Thank you very much for asking me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for being here. And I'll be back in just a moment with a final thought. You know, when John Glenn asks you to check the computer's math just to be sure it's right, you know you have a head for numbers. It's a gift for Katherine Johnson, and I can't help but wonder whether she would have discovered that gift and shared it with the space program if she hadn't had parents who insisted on getting her the best education that could be had. So how many Katherine Johnsons are out there this year, in 2011, with undiscovered gifts that we can nurture and leverage? Well, if their parents are undocumented immigrants, we may never know. Children brought to the United States by their parents through no fault or intention of their own can go to school through 12th grade here, but as graduation looms, so do some very unpleasant realities. Federal law prohibits them from getting in-state tuition, even though they may have lived in the state most of their lives. And now comes a bill in the Virginia General Assembly from Delegate Christopher Peace that would make Virginia the 4th state that prohibits undocumented students from even entering Virginia colleges at all. Right now, colleges set their own admission policies, and federal law prohibits undocumented students from getting federal financial aid. Thus begins the tightrope walk for students who've grown up in this country but are not legally present. Without access to college, these students face a stark future: return to a country they don't know, where there may no longer be any family, or live in the shadows like their parents do, taking low-paying jobs or being lured by the promise of riches in criminal enterprise. Without documents, it's a terrible choice. If you think it's as easy as going down to immigration and stepping your foot on that pathway to citizenship, think again. These students don't want to expose their parents, but they do want an education and the ability to contribute to this country that they call home in the same way any American citizen does. The DREAM Act would have granted conditional permanent residency to undocumented immigrants who graduate from U.S. high schools, are of good moral character, arrived here as minors, and have been in the country continuously and illegally for at least 5 years before the bill becomes law. In exchange, these immigrants would have been required to complete 2 years of military service or 2 years at a 4-year institution of higher learning. The DREAM Act was blocked by Senate filibuster in December, but no amount of legislative gymnastics will stop this tragedy in the making. Staring us in the face is the fact that there are 65,000 students in this country graduating from high school with good grades, extracurriculars, and community service, and no hope of going any further. And what if among them is the next Katherine Johnson?
Build deep and complete.
Do you know of the water of life?
What's the big idea? What's the big idea? Original again, start from the heart. Not art, true indeed. I see, I freeze. Mathematics, matrix, institutes, patterns. 1, 2, 3, you learn naturally.
Yes, Ashima family. We're rolling into the next phase of the tributes. This part goes into the analytical geometry. It gives a sense of what is meant by analytical geometry, which is the specialism of the one, the Grandcestor. So let us keep a steady meditation and honor the one with concentration. Even if you don't feel you get fully what's been spoken about, please relax and just absorb, and we'll follow through.
To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
Hi. Our lecture for today probably should be entitled, "It Should Have Been Functions, but It's Analytic Geometry Instead," or "A Picture is Worth 1,000 Words." What we hope to do today is to establish the fact that whereas in the study of calculus, when we deal with rate of change, we are interested in analytic terms, that more often than not, we prefer to visualize things more intuitively in terms of a graph or other suitable visual aid. And that actually, this is not quite as alien or as profound as it may at first glance seem. Consider, for example, the businessman who says, profits rose. Profits rose. Now, you know, profits don't rise unless the safe blows up or something like this. What profits do is they increase or they decrease. The reason that we say profits rise is that when the profits are increasing, if we are plotting profit in terms of time, the resulting graph shows a rising tendency. As the profit increases, the curve rises. And in other words, then, we begin to establish the feeling that we can identify the analytic term increasing with the geometric term rising. And this identification, whereby difficult arithmetic concepts are visualized pictorially, is something that begins not only very early in the history of man, but very early in the development of the mathematics curriculum. Oh, as a case in point, consider the problem of 5 divided by 3 versus 6 divided by 3. I remember when I was in grade school that this particular problem always seemed more appealing to me than this problem. That 6 divided by 3 seemed natural, but 5 divided by 3 didn't. And the reason is that in terms of visualizing tally marks, it was much easier to see how you divide 6 tallies into 3 groups than 5 tallies into 3 groups. However, as soon as we pick length as our model, the idea is this: either one can divide a line into 3 parts of equal length, or one can't divide the line. Now, if I can geometrically divide this line into 3 equal parts, and in plane geometry we learn to do this, then the fact is that I can divide this line segment into 3 equal parts, regardless of how long this line happens to be. Oh, to be sure, if this line happens to be 6 units long, this point is named 2. And if, on the other hand, the line happens to be only 5 inches long, the resulting point is named 5/3. But notice that in either case, I can, in a very natural way, define or identify either ratio as a point on the line. And this idea of identifying numerical concepts called numbers with geometric concepts called points is a very old device, and a device that was used and still is used in the curriculum today under the name of the number line, under the name of graphs, and what we will use as a fundamental building block as our course develops. Now, you know, in the same way that we can think of a single number as being a point on a line, we can think of a pair of numbers, an ordered pair of numbers, as being a point in the plane. This is Descartes' geometry, which we can call coordinate geometry. The idea being that in the same way that we can locate a number along the x-axis, shall we say, we could have located a number pair as a point in the plane. Namely, 2, 3 would mean the point whose x-coordinate was 2 and whose y-coordinate was 3. By the way, the reason that we say ordered pairs is if you observe 2, 3 and 3, 2 happen to be different pairs. And notice again how vividly the geometric interpretation of this is. Namely, in terms of locating a point in space, it's obvious that the point named 2, 3 is not the same as the point named 3, 2. Again, the important thing is this. When I think of 5 divided by 3, when I think of the ordered pair 2, 3, I do not have to think of a picture. I can think of these things analytically, but the picture gives me certain insights that will help me with my intuition, an aid that I don't want to relinquish. For example, going back to the graph again, thinking of the analytic term greater than. Notice how much easier it is to think of, for example,
welcome to the Black
higher than
University Show.
See one point being higher than another, or to the right of.
African place of being.
You see, geometric concepts to name analytic statements, or instead of increasing, as we mentioned before, to say rising. And there will be many, many more such identifications as we go along with our course. At any rate, let's continue to see then what is the relationship then between functions that we talked about and graphs. The idea is something like this. Let's return to our friend of the first lecture, S equals 16t squared. We can think of a distance machine being the function, where the input will be time, and the output will be what? The square of the input multiplied by 16. Observe that from this, I do not have to have any picture to understand what's happening here. Namely, I can measure an input, measure an output, and observe analytically what is happening. However, as we saw last time, our graph sort of shows us at a glance what seems to be happening, that we can identify rising and falling with increasing and decreasing and things of this type. We will explore this, of course, in much more detail as we continue in our course. By the way, there's no reason why the input has to be a single number. For example, why couldn't the input be an ordered pair of numbers? Among other things, let's take a simple geometric example. Consider, for example, finding the volume of a cylinder in terms of the radius of its base and the height. We know from solid geometry that the volume is pi r squared h. We can therefore think of a volume machine where the input is the ordered pair r comma h, and the output is the single number pi r squared h. And by the way, notice here the meaning of ordered pair. You see, if the pair 2, 3 goes into the machine, notice that the recipe here says what? You square the first member of the pair. In other words, if 2, 3 is the input, we square 2, which is 4, multiply by 3, which is 12, and 12 times pi, of course, is 12 pi. On the other hand, if the input is 3, 2, the first member is 3, our recipe squares the first member, that would be 9, times 2 is 18, times pi is 18 pi. But again, observe that I at no time needed a picture to visualize what was happening here. Of course, if I wanted a picture, I could try to plot this also, but notice now that my graph would probably need 3 dimensions to draw. And why would it need 3 dimensions? Well, notice that my input has 2 independent measurements, r and h, and therefore I would need 2 dimensions just to take care of r and h. Then I would need a 3rd dimension to plot v. And by the way, notice the next stage. If I had an input that consisted of 3 independent measurements, this would still make sense, but now I would be at a loss for the picture. In other words, what I'm trying to bring out next is the fact that whereas pictures are a tremendous help, maybe a second subtitle to our lecture should have been, a picture is worth 1,000 words, provided you can draw it. Because you see, if we needed 3 independent dimensions to locate the input, and then a 4th one to locate the output, how would we draw the picture? By the way, this happens in high school algebra again, if you want to see the analogy. Look at, for example, the algebraic equation a plus b squared. We learn in algebra that this is a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Observe that we do not need to have a picture to understand how this works. Oh, to be sure, if we had a picture,
welcome to the Black Open University show.
We get a tremendous amount of insight as to what's happening here. Namely, let's visualize a square whose side is a plus b. On the one hand, you see, the area of the square would be a plus b squared, you see, the side squared. On the other hand, if we now subdivide this figure this way, we see that that same square is made up of 4 pieces, having 1 piece of area a squared, 2 pieces of area AB, and 1 piece of area b squared. And so we see, on the other hand, that the area of the square is a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. And so again, observe that whereas this stands on its own 2 legs, the picture helps us quite a bit. By the way, we could continue this with a cube over here. Namely, it turns out that a plus b cubed is a cubed plus 3a squared b plus 3ab squared plus b cubed. And again, if we wanted to, and we won't take the time here, but if we wanted to, we could now draw a cube whose side is a plus b. Namely, we could take the same diagram that we had before and now make a third dimension to it. And if you did that, you would see what? That the cube, whose volume is a plus b cubed, is divided into 8 pieces. 1 of size a by a by a, 3 of size a by a by b, 3 of size a by b, and 1 of size b by b by b. Again, the picture is a tremendous visual aid. Now, the key step is this. If we were to now give in to our geometric intuition and say, look at, why worry about algebra when it's so much easier to do this thing by geometry? The counterexample is, consider a plus b to the 4th power. Now, by the binomial theorem, and I might add, the same binomial theorem that allowed us to get these results, we can also write that this is what? It's a to the 4th plus 4a cubed b plus 6a squared b squared plus 4ab cubed plus b to the 4th. Now, it's not important how we get this result. The important point is that analytically, we can raise a number to the 4th power just as easily as we can to the 3rd power or the 2nd power. The only difference is that in the case of the 3rd power, we had a picture that we could use. In the 4th power case, we didn't have a picture. And what a tragedy it would have been to say, hey, we can't solve this problem because we can't draw the picture. And by the way, as a rather interesting aside, notice the geometric influence on how we read this. This is called a plus b to the 4th power. But somehow or other, we don't call this one a plus b to the 3rd power. We call it a plus b cubed, suggesting the geometric configuration of the cube. And here we don't usually say a plus b to the 2nd power. We say a plus b squared. You see, the idea is that when the picture is available, it gives us a tremendous insight as to what can be done, and it helps us learn to visualize what's happening analytically. In fact, what usually happens is we use the picture to justify what's happening analytically when we can see the picture, and then just carry the analytic part through unimpeded in the case where we can't draw the picture. Let me give you another example of this. Let's look at the following set. That also should review our language of sets for us. Let S be the set of all ordered pairs x comma y such that x squared plus y squared equals 25. Question. Does the ordered pair 3 comma 4 belong to S? Answer, yes. How do we know? Well, we have a test for membership. We're supposed to do what? Square each of the entries, each of the numbers, add them, and if the answer is 25, then that ordered pair belongs to S. 3 squared plus 4 squared is 25, so this pair belongs to S. How about 1 comma 2? Well, 1 squared plus 2 squared is 1 plus 4, which is 5. 5 is not equal to 25, so 1 comma 2 does not belong to S. Well, did we need any geometry to be able to visualize this result? Hopefully, one did not need any geometry to visualize this result. On the other hand, then, what does it mean in analytic geometry when we say that x squared plus y squared equals 25 is a circle? As badly as I draw x squared plus y squared equals 25 looks less like a circle than the circle I drew over here. You see, what we really mean is this. Consider all the points in the plane x comma y for which x squared plus y squared equals 25. These are precisely the points on this particular circle. And the easiest way to see that, of course, is that since the radius of the circle is 5, and the point x comma y means that this length is x and this length is y, notice that from the Pythagorean theorem, we see at once that x squared plus y squared equals 25. Now, again, the solution set to this equation is our set S, whether we're thinking of this thing algebraically or geometrically. On the other hand, watch what our picture seems to give us that we didn't have before. Let's return to our point 1 comma 2, which we saw didn't belong to S. Well, look at this. Where would 1 comma 2 be? 1 comma 2 would be inside the circle. Why is that? Because, you see, if we take the point 1, 2,
Welcome to the Black Open University Show.
if we take, say, for example, the point 1, 2, notice that the distance from the origin to the point 1, 2 is less than 5. In other words, the distance is less than 5, so the square of the distance is less than 25. In other words, not only can we say that 1, 2 does not belong to S, which we could have said without the picture, we can now say what? 1, 2 is, and notice the geometric language here, is inside the circle. In other words, the study of inequalities can now be reduced, instead of talking about less than and greater than, we can now talk about such things as inside and outside. You see, inside the circle, which is a simple geometric concept, just means what? The set of all points for which x squared plus y squared is less than 25. Outside that circle, x squared plus y squared is greater than 25. On the circle, x squared plus y squared equals 25. Again, a nice identification between numbers and pictures, analysis and geometry. Well, this then shows us why we want to study pictures rather than functions. Now, if we look at any textbook in which we deal with graphs, it always seems that we start with graphs of straight lines. And the question is, what is so great about a straight line? After all, our pictures in general are going to be much more complicated than that. What advantage is there in starting with straight lines? And again, we begin to realize how straight lines are the backbone of all types of analytical procedures and all types of curve plotting. For example, let's suppose we were studying this particular curve, and we wanted to know what was happening to that curve in a neighborhood around the point P. Let's draw in the tangent line to the curve at the point P. Notice that this line that we've drawn serves as a wonderful approximation curve itself if we stay close enough to the point of tangency. In other words, notice how much we can deduce about this curve if we study only the straight line segment at the point of tangency. Of course, the approximation gets worse and worse as we move further and further out. But in a neighborhood of the point of what's going on, notice again then that the straight line is an important building block. By the way, again, we use straight lines in a rather subtle way in something called interpolation. For example, let's suppose I go to a log table and I look up the log of 2. I find that the log of 2 is 0.301. I look up the log of 4. I find that's 0.602. Now I look for the log of 3 and I see that it's been obliterated. I don't know what it is. So I say, well, let me guess. 3 is halfway between 2 and 4. Therefore, I would suspect that the log of 3 is halfway between the log of 2 and the log of 4. And so halfway between here would be about, what, 4, 5, 2, roughly speaking. All of a sudden, the obliteration on my book clears up, and I look, and I don't find 0.452. Instead, I find, let's write it over here. What I find is 0.477. Now, you know, this is a pretty big error to attribute to slide rule inaccuracy or trouble in rounding off the tables. What really went wrong over here? And the answer comes up again that unless otherwise specified, the process known as interpolation hinges on replacing a curve by a straight line approximation. In fact, you see, if we were to draw the curve of the logarithm function, we would find that the picture is something like this. And when we looked up the log of 2, this height is what we found in the table. When we looked up the log of 4, this height is what we would have found in the table. If we had looked up in the table the log of 3, this is the height that we would have found. This is the height that's 0.477. Notice that in general, if we go halfway from here to here, we do not go halfway from here to here. It depends on the shape of the curve. The only time you can be sure that you have proportional parts is if the curve that joined these 2 points was a straight line. Okay? And notice, by the way, that by the shape of this curve, the straight line falls below the curve, and therefore the height that we found was to the straight line, not to the curve. That was the 0.452. you see. In other words, notice that we got a smaller than the right answer because we approximated as if it was a straight line that was joining the curve. You see, what interpolation hinges on is that the size of the interval is very small, and that you can assume that for the accuracy that you're interested in, that the straight line approximation to the curve is sufficiently accurate to represent the curve itself. Well, enough about that. Once we've talked about why straight lines are important, the next thing is, how do we measure straight lines? See, another interesting point is something like this. Many times we know what something means subjectively, but we don't know what it means objectively. For example, one way of finding a line is to know 2 points on the line. Another way is to know 1 point and the slant of the line. The question that comes up is, how do you measure the slant of a line? In other words, shall you say that the line is very slanty? And if the answer to that is yes, how do you distinguish between slanty and very slanty? Steep and very steep. Very steep and very, very steep. We need something more objective. And the way we get around this is as follows. Given a line, we define the slope as follows. We pick any 2 points on the line. And from those 2 points, we can measure what we call the run of the line. In other words, how far you've gone this way, and the rise of the line, how much it's risen this way. And what we do is we define the slope to be the rise divided by the run. Or, without the delta notation in here, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. By the way, there are little problems that come up. After all, our answer should not depend on the picture. It should be sort of self-contained analytically. The question that comes up is, what if I had labeled this point x2, y2, and this point x1, y1? What would have happened then? And observe that as long as we keep the pairs straight, it makes no difference whether you write this or whether you write this, because you see in each case all you've done is change the sign, and negative over negative is positive. So certainly our answer to what a slope is objective enough so it does not depend on how the points are labeled. A second objection that most people have is they say something like, well, who are you to say that we picked these 2 points? What if I came along and picked these 2 points, and I now computed the slope by taking this as my delta y and this as my delta x? Obviously, it would be a tragedy if the answer to the problem depended on which pair of points you picked, since a line should have but one slope. Again, notice that our high school training in geometry, similar triangles, motivates why we pick ratios. Namely, while this delta y and this delta y may be different, and this delta x and this delta x may be different, what is true is that the ratio of this delta y to this delta x is the same as the ratio of this delta y to this delta x. And that's why we pick the ratio. By the way, another way of talking about ratio is if you look at delta y divided by delta x, and you've had some trigonometry, it reminds you of a trigonometric relationship. Namely, you look at delta y, you look at delta x, and you say, my, isn't that just the tangent of this particular angle? Couldn't I define the slope? And by the way, the general symbol for slope, for better or for worse, just happens to be the letter m. Why couldn't I define m to be the tangent of phi? And by the where phi is the angle that the straight line makes with the positive x-axis. And of course, there is a little subtlety here that we should pay attention to. This would be an ambiguous definition if the scale on the x and the y-axis were not the same. In other words, notice that by changing the scale here, I can distort the same analytic information. So if I agree, however, that the unit on the x-axis is the same as the unit on the y-axis, then I can say, okay, the slope is also tangent of the angle phi. I much prefer to say it's delta y divided by delta x, because then if I forget the scale, I'm still in no trouble. On the other hand, if we use the tangent definition, we can utilize all we know about trigonometry to get some other interesting results. Namely, the question that might come up is, can we study the slopes of 2 different lines very conveniently in terms of our definition of slope? And the answer is this. If we imagine now that our lines are drawn to scale here, and here are 2 different lines, which I'll call L1 and L2. And we'll call the angle that L1 makes with the positive x-axis phi1, the angle that L2 makes with the positive x-axis phi2. Therefore what? M1 is tan phi1, M2 is tan phi 2. Notice that our formula for the tangent of the difference of two angles, you see, notice that this angle here is what? Since this angle is the sum of these two, this angle here is phi 2 minus phi 1, or the negative of phi 1 minus phi 2. Should have had this phi 2 minus phi 1, but since that just changes the sign, that will not have any bearing on the point I want to make. Let's continue this way. Tangent of phi 1 minus phi 2 is tan phi 1 minus tan phi 2 over 1 plus tan phi 1 tan phi 2. On the other hand, by our definitions of M1 and M2, this is M1 minus M2 over 1 plus M1 M2. Excuse me. Now this tells me how to find the angle between two lines just in terms of knowing their slope. Two very special, interesting cases as extremes suggest themselves right away. One case is, what happens if the lines are parallel? If the lines are parallel, you see, phi 1 equals phi 2, in which case phi 1 minus phi 2 is 0, in which case the tangent of phi 1 minus phi 2 had better be 0. But the only way a fraction can be 0 is for the numerator to be 0, and that means that M1 must equal M2. In other words, in terms of slopes, we can study parallel lines just by equating their slopes. A less obvious relationship that's equally important is, how do you measure whether two lines are perpendicular? The answer is, if they're perpendicular, the angle between them is 90 degrees. The tangent of 90 degrees is infinity, as we learned. That's equivalent to saying what? That the denominator is 0. See, the only way a fraction blows up is for the denominator to be 0. But the only way that 1 plus M1 M2 can be 0 is for what? M1 M2 to be equal to minus 1. And this gives us the other very well-known result, that in terms of slopes, to study whether two lines are perpendicular, all we need to investigate is whether one slope is the negative reciprocal of the other. Well, again, the textbook will bring out slopes in more detail. The next question that we'd like to bring up is, in terms of a picture is worth 1,000 words, is how do you identify the straight line with an algebraic equation? What do we mean by the equation of a straight line? Well, again, there are two possibilities. The first possibility is that the line is parallel to the y-axis. If the line is parallel to the y-axis, if the line goes through the point A, 0, notice that the only criteria for the point to be on that line is that its x-coordinate equal A. By the way, this is often abbreviated in a textbook as the line x equals A. Many a student says, how do you know this is a line? Why isn't this the point x equals A? And here again is a good review of why we stress the language of sets. Here again is a good reason why we express the language of sets so strongly. Namely, go back to the universe of discourse here. When you see the set of all ordered pairs x comma y, for which x equals A, this gives you the hint that you're talking about pairs of points, and that tells you that you have numbers in the plane, not on the line, not on the x-axis, a two-dimensional interpretation over here. You see, if this said the set of all x, such that x equals A, it would just be a point. But notice the hint over here. At any rate, this then becomes the equation of a straight line, if the straight line is parallel to the y-axis. Of course, the other possibility is, what if the line isn't parallel to the x-axis? And here, too, we say, okay, suppose we know a point on the line, and suppose we know the slope of the line. What we will do is pick any other point in the plane, which we will label arbitrarily x comma y, and see what equation x comma y has to satisfy. How do the coordinates have to be related to be on this line? Well, we already know that slope does not depend on which 2 points you pick. Consequently, since the slope of this line is m, the slope must also be what? Y minus y1 over x minus x1, and this becomes the fundamental definition for the equation of a line which is not parallel to the y-axis. And by the way, again, I think m's and x1s and y1s tend to give you a bit of hardship at first till you get used to them. Let's illustrate this thing with a specific example. Suppose I say to you, I am thinking of the line whose slope is 3 and which passes through the point 2, 5. And notice the language of sets here. To say that 2, 5 is on the line is the same as saying that 2 comma 5 belongs to the set of points determined by the line. Drawing a rough sketch over here, and by the way, notice something very important here. I never have to draw to scale, because you see, all I'm going to use is the analytic terms, and 2 comma 5 is still 2 and 5 no matter how I draw the picture. So for example, if I say, okay, let's see what it means for the point x comma y to belong here. I say, well, what does that mean? My slope is going to have to be what? Y minus 5, that's my rise. My run is x minus 2, and that must equal 3. And if I clear this of fractions, I get what? Y is equal to 3x minus 1. By the way, does this check out? If x is 2, 2 times 3 is 6 minus 1 is 5, 2 comma 5 is on the line. You see, here's the thing. We talked about the line geometrically. Now I have an algebraic equation. I no longer have to refer to the picture. I have something analytic now. For example, suppose a person says to me, I wonder if the point 8 comma 23 is on this line. I don't have to draw a picture to scale. I don't have to waste any time. I know that the equation of my line is y equals 3x minus 1. By the way, if y equals 3x minus 1, as soon as x is 8, what must y equal? Y must equal, what, 23? Is that right? And so is the point 8 comma 23 on the line? Yes. How about 8 comma 12? 8 comma 12 isn't on the line because 3 times 8 minus 1 is not 12, but notice that we can even see algebraically that 8 comma 12 must be below the line. In other words, our study of equations allows us not only to visualize lines as equations, but we can also visualize inequalities as pictures. In other words, if we have the equation of a line, if this is the line y equals, say, 3x plus 1 or something like this, then what is this region here? These are all those values whose heights lie below the height to be on the curve. Again, not a very clear example in the sense of drawing the picture neatly for you, but our main aim is not to draw neat pictures here. Our main aim is to show how analytic terms can be studied very conveniently in terms of pictures. In fact, perhaps to conclude today's lesson, what we should talk about is an old algebraic concept called simultaneous equations. Suppose you're asked to solve this pair of equations. You say, well, let's see, if y equals 3x minus 1, and it's also equal to x plus 1, that says that x plus 1 equals 3x minus 1. I now solve this thing algebraically. I get 2x equals 2, so x equals 1. Knowing that x equals 1, I can see that y equals 2, and I see that 1 comma 2 is my solution. In other words, if I want to look at this thing algebraically, 1 comma 2 is the only member that belongs to both of these two solution sets. Now, again, notice how I can solve this purely analytic problem without recourse to a picture. On the other hand, if I want to think of this thing pictorially, notice that y equals 3x minus 1 is the equation of a particular straight line. And y equals x plus 1 is also the equation of a line. Notice that since these two lines are not parallel, they intersect at one particular point. And the geometric problem that I solved on the previous board turns out to be that the point 1 comma 2 is the point that both of these lines have in common. In fact, if we call this line as before L1, and if we name this L2, in the language of sets, 1 comma 2 is what? The point which is the intersection of the two lines L1 and L2. Again, a geometric interpretation for an analytic problem. In fact, notice also how much mileage I can get out of the geometric picture. For example, notice that this region here has a very nice geometric interpretation. It's a set of what? All points which are below this line and above this line. In other words, what? To be below this line, y must be less than x plus 1. And to be above this line, y must be greater than 3x minus 1. Notice then that a pair of simultaneous inequalities, which may not be that easy to handle, are very easy to handle in terms of regions in the plane. Notice also that since two lines can either be parallel or not parallel, we also get a nice geometric interpretation as to why simultaneous equations may have one solution, namely the lines are not parallel and hence they intersect, or no solutions, the lines could have been parallel without intersecting, or infinitely many solutions. The two lines could have been different equations. In effect, I should say what? The two equations could have been different equations for the same line. Again, this may seem a little bit sketchy and rapid, but all we want to do is give the overview. The reading assignment in the text goes into great detail on the points that we've mentioned so far. But again, in summary, what our lesson was supposed to be today was to indicate the importance of being able to visualize and to identify analytic results with geometric pictures. And so until next time, goodbye.
Build deep and complete. Welcome to the Black Open University Show.
Yes, Ashima. I know that was a marathon, wasn't it? But that was fantastic.
You learn naturally radio.
This is where the beloved Katherine Johnson, grandsister, her mind was in these places, innovating in these spaces. Fantastic. Well done for your steadiness. We've got a little piece more. It's a bit lighter now, so you've done well. Obviously, you'll have to touch into the show notes to get the actual videos, the samples those were taken from, so that you can see what was being spoken about. It's a good tactic to listen first to these mathematical reasonings and then to watch it, rather than trying to see it first. If you can see it in the mind, is visualization. This is a key value for mathematics, to enhance visualization. Stay tuned. Black Open University.
African place of being. Welcome to the Black Open University Show, building education from an African place of being. Radio.
You learn naturally radio.
You learn naturally radio.
Yes.
So that's the assignment. 5,000 steps by hand, or write a computer program that will do it in a minute or two. It's interesting historically that in the years before computers, of course, they didn't have that choice. It was literally 5,000 steps by hand. And the introduction of Euler's method, largely by Katherine Johnson and her group at NASA, changed what scientists were able to do by making these numerical computations possible. The clip from the movie Hidden Figures illustrates that scene very dramatically, with Taraji P. Henson playing Katherine Johnson.
Is when the capsule moves from an elliptical orbit to a parabolic orbit. There's no mathematical formula for that. Because we can calculate launch and landing, but without this conversion, the capsule stays in orbit. We can't bring it back home.
Maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong.
How's that?
Maybe it's not new math at all.
It could be old math. Something that looks at the problem numerically and not theoretically. Math is always dependable.
For you, it is.
Euler's method.
Euler's method.
Yes.
That's ancient.
But it works. It works numerically.
That's it.
So that's Hollywood. Let's actually take a second and look at the real Katherine Johnson, who is going to describe the type of calculation she made for the Apollo and the Mercury astronaut missions.
Commander Alan B. Shepard was to become the first man sent into suborbital flight. The Mercury capsule is right on course.
Our office computed every mission that went out at that time. The height, the speed, and so on. It became a geometry problem.
Ignition sequence start.
I felt most proud of the success of the Apollo mission. They were going to the moon. I computed the path that would get you there. You determined where you were on Earth when you started out and where the moon would be at a given time. We told them how fast they would be going, and the moon would be there by the time you got there.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
So what Katherine Johnson was doing was solving a differential equation by use of Euler's method. And in this case, the differential equation is, here is the Earth, and here is the moon, and what you want to do is you want to compute a trajectory. Here's your little takeoff point from the Earth, and you want to compute a trajectory that goes like that and lands you exactly on the moon. Then when you come home, you have to have another complicated trajectory calculated. And the Euler's method here is just lots and lots and lots of tiny little finite steps approximating this complicated orbit. And she had been doing that by hand. And then there's a scene which is accurate in the movie where they first wheel in these giant machines, room-size machines, that they call computing machines. And this was a computing machine. Previously, the word computer referred to a person. It was an occupation. What do you do? Oh, I'm a computer for NASA. I work at Langley. And the interesting thing is a very good book which I recommend called When Computers Were Human by David Allen Greer. And he tells the whole story of the army of people called computers, and by the way, 98% of them were women, who actually carried out hand calculations of artillery trajectories for the Army, ballistic trajectories for the Navy, pursuit problems for the Navy, rooms full of women with hand calculators calculating complicated trajectories. And in this case, of course, the differential equation that she's solving has to do with the positions and velocities, and there's an x position of the satellite, of the rocket, and a y position and a z position, and there's an x prime, y prime, z prime, and Newton's laws give you the forces of gravity that apply, and you just have to apply Euler's method 50,000 times. And because you want a short time step, because the longer time step saves you time, but you could very well, with a bigger time step, end up doing that which you really don't want to do. So you need a short time step to stay accurate, but that means you have a lot of time steps. And so the problem was, these are massive computations. We have rooms full of women carrying them out, but it takes a long time. And then, and this is historically accurate, there's a scene in the movie Hidden Figures where they wheel in this big computer And the Octavia Spencer character looks at the computer, and they tell her what it's for. And she goes back to her room full of women, and she says, "Ladies, we are either computer programmers or we are unemployed." And she goes, you remember, she steals a book on computing from the library because they wouldn't lend it to her because she's African American. She got that book on computing languages, and they learned computing. And these things, calculations, started to be done with these giant new IBM computers. But as a tiny little footnote, there's a scene in the movie, which is, I checked, it's historically accurate, where John Glenn, the great John Glenn, is going up into an orbital flight, and they tell him that they computed his trajectories with these new computers, and he was accustomed to working with Katherine Johnson and trusted her. And John Glenn says to the head of the program at Houston, he said, "Did the girl check the calculations? I'm not flying unless she checked the calculations." And they asked her to do it, and she did some steps by hand to test the method, and she verified that it was doing it correctly. And Glenn said, "Okay, I will fly."
Build deep and complete.
Do you know of the water of life?
What's the big idea? What's the big idea? Original begin, start from the heart. Not art, too deep. I see, I freeze. Mathematics, matrix, institutes, patterns. 1, 2, 3, you learn naturally. Classic.
Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Rebuilding education from an African place of being. Welcome to the Black Open University Show. Building education from an African place of being.
Yes. Wow. Well, there you have it, you see. I did tell you we were in for a proper tribute show. So you've heard the one speaking in interviews, commentary about her work, but especially for us here at the Black Open University, we should have to feature the actual thing that she was doing. We should actually have to share some insight to this. And this is something that obviously requires unpacking, and we'll be doing that. Members will be doing that. The cadets will be doing it. The pedagogy class will be doing it. It's important to build on our ancestors' work. And I have a very, very specific critique of our value for history that doesn't go into the rediscovery, the journey, so that the ones engaging in history of our legendary characters are often glorifying the history and othering the person to make them exceptional away from everyone, from the I and I. It's vital that we see ourselves in our genius. It's absolutely vital. So, yeah, big up to the one, grandsister, Katherine Johnson, Ras Astamari Katherine Johnson, a fantastic leader, guide in the world of STEM and mathematics, a great inspiration to many globally, and one that, as we were studying the word pattern today, it says that under the definition of pattern, which is an important word in mathematics, mathematics is the study and application of patterns. This word, it comes from a root that basically means the father, the model citizen, the one to be copied, replicated. But obviously that language does something to take away from the feminine balance, the duality of parenthood, the mother and father, the ones to be replicated. And in that, it's important to see a woman like this as a great guide for our ones. Whilst I was preparing this show, I was thinking about the language, how to feature this extent of mathematical reasoning in a show, in a radio show. Can it work? Will people accept that and listen through to come to the summary, the roundedness of the show? Or will many zone out? Would it be too much? And I decided that we need to bring more mathematical language into our space with our young people. Many of us don't have well-defined key terms of mathematics and science around us, and we must. We need to move away from the idea that mathematicians and scientists are the other people, are the ones in special coats. It's not like that. Everyone has a way for calculation, and we should explore the ways that different ones calculate and get to the principle of calculation, of estimation, calculation and forecast, to get to the joys of pattern study, to get to the enhanced visualization, which is, for me, as I said, is the key. What that middle presentation did was gently introduce the differences between analytic mathematics, geometric mathematics, and algebraic mathematics, and in a very nice way. It might have sounded like a load of numbers and letters to some people. It might sound like that. All I would say is, if it sounds like that, just be steady and let it wash over until you ease into it. It's something to ease into. Ease into it and allow the language to come around and explore the root points. This is the advantage of our approach to learning. We spend a lot of time unpacking the classic terms. So in our level 9 class, the beginning of that is the study of the classics: number, measure and ratio. And we define these things very carefully. And with that, a lot of the reasoning that was had, ones could enter it. They could enter it with just those fundamentals properly defined. What is number? What is measure? What is ratio? So to the cadets who are studying these things, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, what you've taken from that. And to the families, the guardians, the parents, the teachers, I'm also interested to hear how you receive the appeal on how we should give tribute to ones like this. I think it goes across the board. All ones who are great mathematicians and scientists and technologists specifically. We should not only just say, okay, they did these things and this is the dates that they did it, and isn't it great? We need to get behind the story and start to journey in that space. If you notice in the narrative, because I have to say it, because Europeans were doing the interviewing, they couldn't touch certain things. They couldn't speak to the harshness of the racism that was debunked when Beloved was doing her thing. They couldn't speak to that, the contradictions of the racism of the day. And so these things get softened up. But there's a real story. And we should hear that story in its proper context and take it from that way to realize that supreme brilliance to shine through all of that. Well, yeah, we're coming to a special point in the show. I could reason on more about this, but I'm going to reserve it for our classes. As I said, this is the Black Open University show. The Black Open University is part of Abundant Centres UK Development Trust. We're a learner cooperative. I also go by the name You Learn Naturally Learners Cooperative. And inside of that, a resource like this show is meant for study. It's meant for review. It's meant to build on in our forums. And it's like that. So those of you who know about the WhatsApp space for the show, hashtag BOU Radio Show, and you have to check in on our special WhatsApp line. If you go through to abundancecentre.org, click under home, you will see the social media link, and under there you'll see all the past shows, and in there at the top you'll see a WhatsApp link. That WhatsApp link will take you into our forum, and in that space you can access our pedagogy guide and all show notes in detail. I do put some show notes out, or some links into the Black Open University WhatsApp forum, and also the Futurist Steamed Up forum, and a few others that we host. But the nuts and bolts of these things, the unpacking of this, the questions and reasoning, that building will take place in the show space, and obviously in the class space. So get involved. Get involved. We're making it real. Yep. Yeah, as you know, there will come a day, and when that day comes, as it is here now, what a beautiful thing. We are rising in that dawn. Don't forget, we've got a festival. The festival is coming up. It's imminent. The festival is from the 6th of March right through to the 15th. All details on abundancecentre.org/festival. And before that, we have our Dark and Wild launch party on the 29th of February. This is Saturday coming. So that's around the corner as well. That's going to be fantastic. Music, great vibes, a very interesting puppet show. Some of you heard about the puppet show that's coming up, and other things. We'll be launching some production persons, our production team for What's the Big Idea. So there'll be a space for some of those ones to come through. And yeah, it's going to be vibrant. You're very welcome to come along, make a contribution to that. This will be at the Chestnut Community Centre from 7 on Saturday. Indeed, there will come a day.
You go immediately to the blackboard. He knew exactly where you were and what was next.
Exiri Masagan Hashima Tawagi Asab. Created to praise, respect the warrior idea.
There'll come a day.
Sehlamta, by the way. That's Sehlamta, just for ones who may not know. I've got an engineer buzzing around. I think he wants to know the meaning of the Sehlamta. So let me just explain it. Exira Yimasagan Hashima Tawagi Asab. This is from the Amarenia language, most of it. The first part means create to be praised. Hashima is a Swahili word. It's derived from Heshima, and that means respect, which we have as a code of conduct. Tawagi Asab is the warrior idea. And the warrior idea is the thoughts and perceptions of the warrior's mind, forming clear desires, intentions and plans for the establishment and maintenance of peace throughout their province. Through the creation of power and the communication of wisdom, the warrior relentlessly strives to grasp all of the Tawagi Asab in the knowledge that the self of the warrior I and the self of the community I and I are one. Exir Maskan Hashima Tawagi Asab. Ba'amarinia, Begiz Kwankwa, as in the old language. Taragazi Helena, Behila, Bosate a Amarozi I. Zahalo Helenat wala botet Bekinyeta zi I. Lemasurato Fikar wala Asfanu. Anaza Yibalu, Kusutata, Hasasata, Helenata, Watamaratata, Ziawitsu Botu Urtu, Bekisitata Babwa Hadro Hail, Lelia, Zambela Mintani Areft, Amaka Helena Zataragazi let Eyokomit Yitsamu, Masurata Ziai, wa Masurata Ziai was the eye, wa Hud, Kaneta et Aik, Amlak Fatari Yetoides, Ashima Taragazi, Helena.
There'll come a day. There'll come a day. There'll come a day when the presence of the moment will truly be all there is. It will be all that will be sought after, revealing within life's riches. There'll come a day when we will stand for truly what we believe in, honoring only the truth as we truly see it. And on this day, the rainbows of light will set us free. Deep within our souls we'll know that only the goodness must show. And on the waves will flow into the midnight we'll go. An abyss of which we'll have no fear, because we'll always know that the Creator is here. Here in our souls, here in our hearts, here in our minds, creating within us a certain peace. A peace withstanding withstanding. All the arrows of persecution, all the vies for validation, a peace we've never ever known in this lifetime, but have many, many, many lifetimes before. Open the door. Open the door to your heart. Release the anger. Release the tension. Release the shame, blame. Release the fear. As you know, the Creator is here, here in abundance for you, so that you may serve another too. Honor that which you hold near and dear, for that is the only reason you are here. Yes, there'll come a day when all the pain and sorrow will wash away, and on the waves of love you see, that's where we'll be, you and me. You and me.